Okay, we're talking Travelers Championship and golf as a whole. It's probably not surprising to hear that golfers are at a high risk for skin cancer. You go walk around, it used to be 4 hours, now it tends to be 5, sometimes longer than that, right in the midday sun, the sunniest parts of the day. So joining me to talk about how you can mitigate your risk and prevention, I'm happy to have Dr. Peter Byeff from Hartford Healthcare Medical Group to tell us more about that. Thank you for being here, Doctor.
No problem, Tim.
It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for taking the time. And we do have a lot of these sun prevention and sort of skin cancer prevention stories, but it's interesting to make this specific to golfers, what they can do to try to minimize their risk. What are some tips?
So basically, you want to be covered up. So I think wearing a hat, wearing perhaps long pants rather than shorts, and sunblock, I think is very, very important because the sun is very strong and you're out there for a number of hours.
Yeah, with hats, I've always wondered. This hasn't so much been a problem with me that I know of, but people forget about their ears.
Well, they don't cover your ears, right?
You're right. Unless you're wearing a wide-brimmed hat, right, too. But do you find that a lot of people sometimes will sort of chafe against the idea of wearing long pants because it could be hot out anyway?
Sure.
Yeah, that's not too good. As far as sunblock, how often should people be applying? What sunblocks are better than others?
So I think that the creams or ointments are better than the sprays, for example. And it should be applied 20 minutes before getting out in the sun, and then it should be reapplied. Certainly if you are exposed to water, for example, if you're in a lake or in the ocean, it should be reapplied after coming out of the water and so forth.
Hopefully for golfers, you're not diving in to find that sliced tee shot. But yeah, you want to reapply every 3 or 4 holes. And this is something that PGA Tour golfers take very seriously. Rory Sabbatini is a very well-known golfer who has had a bout with, he had the squamous cell carcinoma. Adam Scott from Australia, where they have a huge problem with skin cancer down there, had a non-melanoma skin cancer removed from his face. Are there some areas more likely to be affected if we're talking about squamous cell carcinoma and basal cell carcinoma than others?
Yes, in the sun-exposed areas, directly in the sun-exposed. Melanoma can appear almost anywhere on the body, but squamous cell and basal cell are primarily in sun-exposed areas.
And I know we've talked about what to look for in the past, but we can't go over it enough. If you're trying to give yourself a check-over, what should you be looking for?
So you're looking for any ulcerated lesion, if there's any bleeding, if a lesion is growing, for melanoma if it's turning black, and as I mentioned before, if it's growing, for example.
Is there a particular size that becomes worrisome or a particular shape that becomes worrisome?
Irregular shapes can be more worrisome, but basically scaling lesions, non-healing lesions, ulcerated lesions, bleeding lesions. Yeah,
a bleeding lesion I think would be a big one too. Also clothing. I've seen sun protective clothing out there that has its own rating. I'm sure it works, but part of me has a tough time believing that any old shirt wouldn't work just as well.
I'm not sure about that, in terms of the manufacturing of this, but I've seen the same things, particularly in things that you wear in the water, for example.
Yeah, so all right, well, either way, I imagine if there's an error, it's probably on the safer side, that clothing as a whole would be a little more sun protective. So one way or another, just make sure you're protected out there. I think that's the safest way, as opposed to just leaving it to sunscreen. Try to do both. Doctor, thank you so much for the time. That also goes for a lot of people outside watching the Travelers Championship this week too. So thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be here.
Pleasure to have you.
Nice
okay,
to meet you.
One other a note right here.